Chris, thank you very much for sparing the time today.
It's my pleasure.
So I always start with my Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. Um, so I'm going to begin by asking, what is your favorite Ukrainian word?
Oh, uh, um, that's interesting. Okay, my favorite Ukrainian word. Gosh, I really shouldn't struggle with this, but I suppose you could say, I just like the very polite budlaska. Unfortunately, I'm not a Ukrainian speaker. I understand quite a lot of Ukrainian these days. I can speak it on a very, let's say, novice level, but I'm a Russian speaker because I lived in Eastern Ukraine for my first 2 years, and neither is a particularly easy language to learn. But I think what will come as a surprise to some people, well, many people probably, is that there's quite a difference between the two. And jumping from, well, being a non-native speaker, and but a speaker of one of them, to learning another is not as easy as it may seem. There are a lot of similarities, but there are even more differences. And so this is a long way of me saying I'll give you the Russian word that I always liked, because as someone who's not great with languages, I studied Japanese in school for many years, and I was okay with at that. But when I started studying Russian, it was really difficult for me. So I really gave myself, the proverbial pat on the back when I was able to use, not only pronounce, but also use well, dostoprimечательности, which is, if you are a Russian speaker, it's like a notable place, or like a landmark type spot. And it's, an eight-syllable word that, as a non-native speaker, was really difficult to originally learn. So, I think that would be, I guess, my answer to that.
I mean, what you said about the similarities and differences between the two languages. Last summer, I interviewed Anna Reid, the former Economist correspondent
I just met
for
her in Kiev
Ukraine.
when she was here. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Hmm.
Something we talked about was how sort of the fact that Ukrainians and Russians are so similar yet so different is one of the things that drives Moscow insane. Because she sort of compared it to, it's the sort of difference between English people and Scottish people. Like they're sort of similar but also very different.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's something that is at the heart of this war, right? Is Putin's belief, and many Russians' belief, that Ukrainians are merely Russians who have lost their way, and that they are not a separate people with a separate language, with their own culture and identity, and living in a country that is a sovereign one. That is smack at the heart of this war. Of course, Putin has, grander ambitions, and it's also about the West and NATO, and the realignment of global security, in the post-war environment. But he despises Ukrainians. He despises the fact that they exist, that they exist separate from Russians. And so, absolutely, it is one of the core elements of this. And I think, probably, a surprise to many people, if you're not a close watcher of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and say you're someone who might, be generally interested in what's happening over here after 2022 and the start of the full-scale invasion, right? Um, you might not know of the stark differences between the two. But I think if there is, and I've said this, I've had discussions about this with many of my Ukrainian friends, when we're sort of trying to look at, like, what positives could come out of this, right? And if there is a silver lining, and I think there are a few of them. One is certainly that. despite all the disinformation and Russian misinformation and disinformation, and even the messaging from the White House, which uh, is very closely, disturbingly aligned with the Kremlin's, more people than ever in our lifetimes know about Ukraine, Ukrainians, their language, their culture, their resilience, their bravery, and that's a positive thing.
So I was going to ask the Ukrainian version, but you could also give me the Russian version, which is what's your favorite curse word?
Blyat, blyat, of course. Um, it's just you can use it in so many ways, in so many places in a sentence, in so many different situations, and it just even as a non-native speaker, it has, I think, the same amount of punch as I guess it's okay to curse on your program since you just asked me a favorite curse word, as you know, fuck, like you stub your toe, blah, you run into some, kind of road construction project that forces you to make an hour detour, blah, you've got to file another document to get permission to visit, this frontline area or this regiment who you need to do interviews with, blah, I mean, it covers pretty much everything.
Have you used it much over the last few months?
I've used it a lot in the last couple of days. Yeah, no, I was just with another journalist friend of mine. We spent a couple of days out in the Carpathians. I was sort of taking a couple of days, well, trying to take a couple of days off, but then the Russians decided to attack the city center of Sumy, so I had to do a little bit of reporting, which I did on my phone from the top of a mountain in the Carpathians. But just in our conversations, in a mix uh, of English, Russian, Ukrainian, and in moments when we were both joking around and using it in that way, or having a serious conversation, it comes up. And then, certainly I do a lot of interviews with uh, politicians, government officials, many of whom speak Russian, including people in President Zelensky's office, which may or may not be surprising to some people. I think if you're Ukrainian, you're not terribly surprised because he was, first and foremost a Russian speaker from Kryvyi Rih or Kryvyi Rog, um, and has really worked on his Ukrainian and now speaks it excellently. But behind closed doors, he and his team, they like to communicate in whatever the best sort of, or the strongest common language is. And so sometimes for me and some of the people who work with the president, that might be English. Other times it's Russian. And sometimes there are frustrations aired on both sides, and that word has been used certainly in the last couple of months, considering the news developments around, oh, let's just say, arguments in the Oval Office of the White House, or various Russian attacks on civilians, frustrations with certain leadership, or certain Western partners not doing exactly what the government in Kiev had hoped they would do. So yeah, it's come up.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
A sound or noise that I love? No noise, no sound. I've come to really appreciate silence, and because I mean these days, being anywhere in Ukraine, especially anywhere in the war zone, or like the frontline areas in Donetsk Oblast or Kherson or Zaporizhia, but frequently in Kiev on a near daily basis, if not multiple times a day, we hear sirens, we hear explosions. That really has had an impact on people's nervous systems. People are anxious and stressed and very attuned to noise around them and very easily set off by noises. And I've come to realize that I myself am a bit jumpy around certain noises, and so I've really come to enjoy silence, or if not if not complete silence. What I've really been into lately is instrumental music. Like I'm not a bit of, I'm a big music nerd. Like I come from Portland, Oregon originally. My first job in journalism was working as a music journalist. And so I know a lot about, artists and music, and I'm really into it. But I never was big into instrumental uh you know work and albums without lyrics, and until very recently. And then in the last couple of years, I've really enjoyed that type of thing. And so there's a handful of albums that I think, everybody posts their Spotify playlists or whatever, at the end of the year, what they've been listening to. I think if you were to look at mine now, I'm certain that in the top, 10 albums, there would probably be at least five that were completely instrumental.
So I'm constantly torn between sort of the rest of the James Lipton-esque questionnaire, and also you're kind of touching on stuff I've been meaning to talk about, which is um, like the war came to us opens with you want to take a break from being a journalist and join in the Peace Corps in order to explore the world. But as you kind of touched on, you were already working in journalism. So reading the book, I was kind of curious, like, what was it that drew you to being a journalist in the first place?
Uh, well, to go way back, I I guess at the age of 18, 19, like just out of high school, had no real sense of what I wanted to do. And um, being a kid born and raised on the West Coast, I didn't really think about Europe much or anything sort of east of me. I used to think a lot of Asia, and I was really into Japanese culture. As I mentioned, I studied Japanese language for 4 or 5 years in middle school and high school. And I thought of, Asia not as the East, as many people do, but actually as the West, because for me, it was just over the Pacific Ocean, the opposite direction. And so I thought at first in college I would go into business, and I think I was a business major for the first 2 years. But I actually didn't do very well in a lot of the prerequisite classes because a lot of them are math related. And I think I failed a statistics and probability course twice. And I had a professor and guidance counselor tell me, you should actually just drop this and take the incomplete because you're going to fail it a third time. And, why don't we meet to discuss, what might be a better path for you? And actually, it was the two of them who set me on this course of studying writing, and particularly journalism. I was always a very talkative student and very inquisitive, and had a great interest in learning about all just everything. And um I they one of them set me up with an internship at a local newspaper, and I enrolled in and I swear this is the name of it, a news writing 101 course at Portland State University, and I really enjoyed it. And the internship went well. I started writing for several of the sort of like alt weeklies and various smaller newspapers around the Portland area, and I really enjoyed it. I got to meet all of these really cool people doing music, art, entrepreneurship, brewing beer, riding bicycles, or building bicycle companies, and it was really cool. And so I thought, okay, I can make a career out of this. I became a reporter and editor for Oregon Business Magazine before I graduated college. So this is like maybe a couple of years after I changed my major, and was having a great time with it. And then the financial crisis hit in 2008, and that really set me back because at that point, I was graduating from university. I wanted to get a better paying job and to start my career instead of doing this sort of part-time journalism thing while being a student. And so at that point, nobody was really hiring. There were a lot of layoffs happening. and I recalled a conversation that I had had with my uncle and an experience that I had with him when he was a Peace Corps volunteer, which was we were pen pals, and I was learning a lot about his experience as a Peace Corps volunteer overseas. He was serving in a jungle in Ecuador, and so I thought, okay, I could join the Peace Corps, defer my student loans for 2 years, and come back. The economy will have sorted itself out. I'll jump back into my old life and get back on track. And that track, I thought at the time, was uh, getting a job at our state newspaper, and just moving my way up over the years from then on. But when I joined the Peace Corps, I ended up in eastern Ukraine, in the city of Bakhmut, which at the time was still called Artyomov by its Soviet name. That really set me on a different path. I knew at the end of my 2 years there that I wanted to get back into journalism. I was still very interested in that, and probably even more passionate about it. And that came about because I had met so many fascinating people in Ukraine, but I wanted to find a way to do it while remaining in Ukraine. I was no longer interested in coming back to Portland. The world had sort of opened up to me, and I had this incredible experience, and had, truly, um, in that sort of cliche way, like broaden my horizons. But I really did. I felt I was now very small in this huge, huge place with all of these endless things to explore and people to meet and to get to know. And I didn't really want to go back to Portland, which felt so far removed from everything and very isolated in this way. That just kind of made it feel very, very small. So I found a way to stick around, and got a job first at the Kyiv Post, English language newspaper at the time. Um, and from there, over the course of the next many years, worked my way through various news outlets and layoffs and digital media to finally get to being where I am now, which is with the Financial Times.
I can empathize about the maths thing because I also am not very good at maths, and so when people say something like, sort of, it's like saying 2 plus 2 equals 5. I am sort of like, it doesn't. Um, something that it's kind of what you touched on. Something that kept striking me reading "The War Came to Us" is like the dizzying speed with which you went from, I guess, like writing lifestyle pieces about Ukraine to reporting on corruption to covering a revolution to being a war correspondent. Um, and sort of the book feels punctuated by these sort of like what the fuck moments of like sort of realizing what like how did I suddenly be transported into each of these iterations?
Yeah. I will say I purposely wrote, or collected these stories and pieced the book together, as it appears, because I sort of wanted people to experience it as I did. And I think you get that in the sort of more lyrical, broader, slower paced earlier chapters, and then picking up pace and speed at in this, quite well, as you put it, this dizzying way, because that's how I experienced it. And also that's what it feels like to be in Ukraine. You can be out climbing a mountain, and suddenly a breaking news story will hit, because it's that kind of a place, because it's stuck in this precarious position between Russia and a bunch of skeptical Western partners who want to be helpful but are unwilling to go the full way, or give everything that's needed, and a Russia that wants to not allow this country to be free, and to try to pull it back in, and all of these incredible people who are stuck in between that, and um, have agency, and don't want to be told, and are politically minded, and a very active civil society, and that's, I think, what the book shows and tells. And I just thought, these are my experiences. I like to read books like this with, uh, sure, it's a subjective view. It's a fair, depiction of everything, and it's all true. It's real. But it is my subjective view of, these events and as they unfolded. And a lot of it is my reporting and experiences. And I thought, that's just a great way to show not only how I got from where I was when I arrived in Ukraine to now, but also to take a lot of people who haven't had that experience, who are now really curious about Ukraine. Just like I said earlier, there's all these, you know, millions of people who know more about the country than ever before, are, really hungry for information about it, accurate information and stories about it, and they want to hear more about it. And my journey through Ukraine over the course of the last 15 years, I feel extremely fortunate to have had, but also what an incredible way to experience a place and its culture and its people. And I just thought, if I was this captivated by this place, um, and all of these things that transpired, I think it'll probably work well to put it in that form in a book. And the response has been fantastic. I'm a bit surprised actually, like how many people have read it and reached out to tell me how much they've enjoyed it, and have learned from it, or have gone and have also gone back to read a lot of the sections that were pre 2022, pre full scale invasion, and found them really useful. Um, so yeah, it is a wild place to be, and that is a big reason why I've stuck around, because there's no lack of interesting stories to tell. Personal stories of people, or of places, of situations, of moments. And Ukraine has this uncanny way of finding itself in the middle of some of the biggest global stories, for better or worse. And so, I've managed to be here for all of those over the course of the last 15 years. And I guess in terms of the pace and that sort of dizzying bit, I'm not great at slowing down and sort of taking a break and a breath. I'm trying to get better at that, because the last few years in particular have been especially tiring. Uh, but um, I never really wanted to stop. I wanted to keep going, and felt there was a need to, because they're also, maybe I'm getting a little bit, maybe I'm getting a little off topic now, but with the exception of the last few years, and maybe for much of 2014, there haven't been a lot of foreign correspondence and foreign coverage of Ukraine. And so all of those many years in between, there were a lot of people who would maybe, dip their toe in, and then, depart a week later or 2 weeks later or something. But hardly anyone was living in Ukraine full time. So I'm one of very, very, very few foreign correspondents, and one of the only Americans. I mean, I can name my other another friend of mine who works at Reuters who's American, but otherwise it's mostly European journalists, a lot of French correspondents, Italian, German, Viennese, and others who have made Ukraine their home or second home, and have been there throughout the last decade or more. Otherwise, most of the American and British correspondents have been based in London or in Moscow. And for me, I like London just fine. I can't say I had like a great interest in being there over the last several years. Now that I work at the Financial Times, I don't know, maybe there's a future in London. But I never wanted to live in Moscow. I visited several times and other cities outside of Moscow, and I just really disliked the place. It just felt grim, and it was so depressing, and it was not a fun place to work and to do journalism, which is, stands in stark contrast to Ukraine, where people really want to talk to you, they're interested in doing so, and access to people in power comparatively is excellent. And so I just felt like it was a great place to be, and to tell stories, and so I just never really wanted to stop or to leave, even though I tried a couple of times, and I just kept getting pulled back into it.
I mean, I have yet to visit Ukraine, but from whether it's from your book or any other kind of media, um, Ukraine does just feel more joyous than, say, Russia or other places. Like, although your book covers some pretty horrific events, um, there is also like this shining through of like a sort of joy and optimism and sort of can-do attitude that doesn't seem to be the case with Russia.
I agree. That's all accurate. I think Ukrainians are also masters of dark humor and sort of making light out of very dark situations. Um, you've probably, come to see some of that in many of the memes that are put out, related to this war. And uh, no, they are an extremely resilient people. I think, yeah, and they are joyous. And I think they know how to enjoy life, especially, you know, going through what they've gone through in the last 100 years. I mean, you can go back much further, but if you think of what Ukrainians have endured in the past 100 years, the Stalin's famine, the Holodomor. I mean, Nazi occupation during World War II. Soviet control over the many decades that followed by two revolutions, a really bumpy independence and a rough 90s, and then the annexation of part of their territory, followed by a smaller invasion and then a much larger invasion. I mean, they're an incredible people. And so I think that that history um really does build character. And I think it leads to people learning how to enjoy life. um at the same time, I think it's really important also to like underscore just how exhausted people are right now. Ukrainians have done incredible things. We've seen all of that, right? Um, and That's great, but they can't win this war on their own. And I think the exhaustion comes in when they really think, we're capable of doing it, but we do need a significant amount of help to do that. And I think we're seeing this global security order that has existed and kept aggressors and authoritarians in check for decades collapse and crumble. And the country that was supposed to be leading this fracture and slip into authoritarianism. And so it's an especially difficult moment right now. And I think while there are, joyous moments and Ukrainians are, good about making the best out of some of the worst situations you can imagine, they would prefer not to. They would much prefer to be able to live an ordinary, happy, content life that many people in other westernized European or countries live in, or the U.S. in many ways. They don't want to be necessarily a part of history, right? And so I think for all of these stories of strength and resilience and bravery, which are all important to tell, it's also equally important to note that they're still human. They might be capable of incredible things, but they are human um, uh, and worthy of our help, and to not having to go this alone.
On the what you said about the history, I remember when I was reading Anna Reid's Borderlands, and it was like one chapter, the Russian Revolution, the next chapter, the famine, the next chapter, invasion, the next chapter, the Soviets take over, and I was like, oh my god, like relentless.
Relentless. When do they ever get a break?
Mm.
It really is that type of a place. Like they've just they haven't gotten a break in hundreds of years, but certainly not in the last 100.
Kind of as you've touched on, like I'm very much in favor of Britain and Europe continuing to support Ukraine, recover Crimea and the Donbass. I kind of feel like Zelensky could, with European help, either resist or slow roll Trump's ceasefire efforts. But all it's sort of easy for me to like say that, or for Europeans or British people to say that. But and you've kind of touched on this in some of your report recently of like to what extent do Ukrainians want to carry on fighting, or uh, how do they envision, or what is their attitude towards the future of the war?
Well, Ukrainians do not want to have to continue fighting. They would much prefer that they do not need to. And I think Zelensky has been explicitly clear about what he believes he needs in order to bring this war to a close sooner rather than later. Now, some of those things on his sort of victory plan wish list, I think, considering the current political situations in Europe and the US, are just not going to happen. Um, but many of them could. It just takes political will to do so. Um, and and there are a lot of things that have not been done against Russia that, I'm thinking much harsher sanctions and other things that can be done to apply pressure politically, diplomatically, economically on Russia that maybe cost a lot less than these multi-million or billion-dollar weapon systems and security packages that most people think of when they think of how or what is needed to help Ukraine. The Ukrainians will fight as long as they have to. They don't want to have to fight that long because they would like to go back to living and have something resembling an ordinary life. I still think about these conversations that I had not long ago, just last fall with several commanders. I was out in Pokrovsk and Korakova and in Donetsk Oblast. And this one commander, he was a 68-year-old guy, who should be retired, and instead he's commanding a group of guys in a brigade on one of the hottest frontline points of the war right now. And he's got a son who's fighting, and he's got a grandson who's young and not closing in on 18 soon, but he does not want to. He does not want to see his grandson inherit this war, and he would like to see his son, who's in his 30s, be able to live a significant portion of his life without being at war. I think his son is in his mid 30s, he said, early 30s, mid 30s. And, that means he's been living in a place now that has been essentially at war for 15 years. That's almost half of his life. And he was saying, I look forward to a ceasefire, honestly, even though if it might not be a popular opinion, because if we have one and martial law is lifted, I'll do everything in my power to take my family out of here. And he meant out of the country, even. And there are a lot of people who are thinking that. But he did admit that, he didn't want to see Ukraine torn apart and to fall under Russian control, and so he would fight to ensure, as long as he had to, that that didn't happen, that there was still a country and that it remained independent and sovereign, even if it was not fully restored to its 1991 borders. Um, if the question is, what does Ukraine need to win the war? There's a lot to go into that and to unpack in that question, and I don't know if we have the time here. But I think given the situation as it is now, a skeptical US president who's, echoing Kremlin lines, a Europe that is or has been slow to get its act together, but is getting its act together and thinking about what they can do independent of the United States. A Ukraine that, despite its heavy losses, has a much more capable army than it did 3 years ago, is at the forefront in military technologies in so many ways, especially drone warfare, which is helping to fill the manpower gaps. There are things that our countries can do to help it secure, if not a complete, victory and a just and lasting peace, then certainly something that is a hell of a lot better than uh, the current Kremlin demands that the United States seems to be going along with, and suggesting that a quick end to the fighting, meaning just a ceasefire but not a lasting peace, could mean trying to force the Ukrainians to give up the four territories in mainland Ukraine that Russia claims to have annexed: Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk, even though the Russians don't fully occupy any of those four, right? I think there are things we can do and that are being discussed that are positives. They're not, perfect solutions, but things like, European security forces, if they really will step up, the countries that are talking about doing this, France, the UK, if Germany and, the incoming chancellor to be, right, Merz, and really steps up, that could be a big positive. His messaging just, I think it was yesterday, Sunday, about potentially providing Ukraine with Taurus missiles, would be a huge policy shift and a real signal to Russia that it's not going to have an easy way forward, and that this could potentially provide Ukraine with momentum. His message that we need to get Ukraine off the back foot and away from defense and on the offensive, to show Putin that the West means business and that they're not going to just sit back. These are positive things that can put Ukraine in a much stronger um, position, to where I don't know, and I don't like making predictions, and obviously you can tell by my answer, I don't want to say, oh, well, this is what you have to do, and then everything is, going to be just fine, and it'll end like this. Um, so without getting too specific, I think, if these things are done, then by the year's end, we could have a much different situation, which is, I don't think the war would be over in any way. I highly doubt that we're going to see any kind of serious peace negotiation happen this year. But the momentum could shift, and that could be a big positive for Ukraine.
Obviously, I was mortified on the 6th of November, and so I spent like the sort of November, December, January sort of trying to process everything. And I was listening to the audiobook of one of my favorite books, which is Margaret Macmillan's Paris 1919, about the Treaty of Versailles. And as I was listening to it, and she was talking about Woodrow Wilson, it occurred to me for the first time the weird similarities between Trump and Woodrow Wilson. One of which is a sort of what you very much got in sort of like December, January, of like he is the only person who can bring peace to Europe, whether Europeans like it or not, and he will dictate what sort of they get, and everyone will agree to it because America is so powerful that it can just dictate whatever. And so I've been fascinated over the last few months of how like that sort of flush with victory arrogance has sort of started to crumble. And on the one hand, there's been the sort of the there's no coherent, much like I guess tariffs, no coherent policy. There's a sort of Keith Kellogg has one idea of how it should be. Steve Witkoff has another idea how it should be. It isn't very clear how Trump sides one way or the other. And then on the other hand, the European reassurance force. It kind of felt like Trump mentioned it almost offhand without thinking about it, and then since then, Britain and France have kind of seized on it as a way to sort of bring Ukraine into European security in a way that could be much faster than if Russia had simply just withdrew and there was a general peace and eventually NATO just kept getting putting off and off and off. But Russia can't really trash the idea too much because it's Trump's idea.
Yeah, yeah. I think you know why that is, that there's no cohesive or coherent policy. It's because none of them know anything about Ukraine or Eastern Europe. None of them really know Russia. They think they do. They love to say that they do. Trump loves to say he's got a great relationship with Putin. Oh, he knows him so well. No, he's met him a couple of times. He's been to Moscow, what, once or twice, like over the course of his lifetime. He is not a reader of books. He has the attention span of a gnat. This is not somebody who has delved very deeply into the history of Eastern Europe, let alone or Europe, let alone Eastern Europe. And so, he is trying to fix a problem that requires a scalpel with a fucking hatchet. This is an area of the world with a lot of complexity. This is a war that I think, while on the surface there is very much a black and white element, that being a good and an evil, Ukraine good, Russia evil, and that seems simple. And yet he can't even understand that because he sided with Russia, just as he did with this statement about the Sumi missile attack, in which he says, "Oh, it's terrible. I was told that they made a mistake." He couldn't just condemn it. He had to give Russia a way out. He does not understand the complexities of this part of the world, of this war, of the history of it, of Putin's revisionist histories, and neither does his vice president, neither do his special envoys. I think that's really clear. He's got a special envoy trying to solve at least three wars or conflicts, if you count Iran. He's the envoy for Iran, and he's the envoy for Russia, and he's the envoy for the Middle East, right? And Steve Witkoff. And this guy can himself hardly articulate what he is up to. And when he does open his mouth, what comes out are things that sound a lot like the messages from the Kremlin's top propagandists and Russian state media. A good example of that is his interview with Tucker Carlson. And so that's the reason there is no coherent policy. You've got all of these people with various experiences, none of which are based in Eastern European history or politics or diplomacy, and a guy who wants things done quickly, without caring, about how they happen, um, pushing people to do this. I mean, let's not forget that Trump said he would have this war figured out in 24 hours, and here we are, 3 months into his presidency, and no closer to peace. And so, it's that their inability to comprehend the situation and the place, with their, just lack of knowledge to begin with, that I think has led us to this point. Now, if there's an upside, I'm kind of, as you can tell probably, I'm sort of always about finding like a silver lining if there is one. It's really kicked Europe's butt into action, and they are talking about the security force and about how they can up their own production in Europe, to strengthen their defenses, and by doing so, also helping to strengthen Ukraine's. And this is a positive thing.
Last week, you reported on Zelensky's announcement about there being over 150 recruits from China uh, fighting for Russia in Ukraine. And I kind of find that really interesting because the vibe I've gotten for most of the last 3 years is that Zelensky's been very careful with China, like always very always trying to maintain like cordial relations with China, not really getting into the extent to which they're supporting Russia, just kind of like listening to their peace ideas. So after the last week and him sort of, going out to Beijing, um, I did wonder if after the whole disastrous Oval Office meeting, if Zelensky's trying to communicate the war to Trump in terms he'd be responsive to. So if the war is actually about China, not Russia, Trump might change his mind on assistance to Ukraine.
Absolutely. So this is Zelensky trying to get Trump's attention on a matter that is of particular interest to Trump, right? Which is, um, uh, if he can, I think, weakening China and showing his, American dominance over China. And if you listen to Zelensky's remarks on this, he was very careful to say that while there were 150 Chinese soldiers there, he didn't see any. It didn't mean that there was any direct Beijing involvement. But he did say, very interestingly, to us that this meant, or that he knew the leadership of China knew about it, and they weren't doing anything to stop it, which is how I wrote it in the lead, because I think it's more interesting to say that China allowed these guys to be recruited and go to fight, right, and did nothing to stop them, than to say Russia recruited Chinese fighters to go and fight. And so that was the point that Zelensky was saying, was that the Chinese leadership knows this is happening, but they're not doing anything to stop it. But it doesn't mean they're directly involved. So he was sort of giving them a way out, right? Showing that he knows this is happening. He would like it to stop, right? It's sort of a roundabout way of asking politely and to say that right, that this is happening, while messaging to Trump, look, China's involved now. There's a new international element or dynamic here, and it's not only Iran, who you also are in conflict with and you want to weaken, and you're currently negotiating with, but now China and North Korea. And Trump, while uh, wanting to sort of put all these countries in their places, he also says he has special relationships with all of their leaders too, right? Besides Putin, he's also said that about Xi in China and Kim Jong-un in North Korea, right? So this is Zelensky doing what he thinks he's good at, and that is using his oratory skills and public platform to signal to Trump, look, this is another reason why you need to be involved here, because China's involved here. It's also a way for Zelensky to ensure that Ukraine remains in the headlines. A lot of the front page news for the last couple of weeks has been Trump, tariffs, trade war, and unfortunately, that has meant that there's not a whole lot of space, or there hasn't been as much space for Ukraine. And that's not because the situation here has, it is no longer important. It's just that Trump has a way of sucking all of the oxygen out of a room and leaving, very little or none for others. And so this trade war story really. Um, has been front and center, and the capture of these two Chinese soldiers is a way of him, yes, making this overture to Trump, but also keeping international attention on the war. I don't think for a moment that 150 Chinese soldiers are going to make a huge difference, but they're part of a broadening coalition of foreign fighters that the Russians are recruiting and using. And I think that's really interesting and something that, we have followed and will continue to follow. We reported a story on the Russians using Yemeni fighters and Indians and mercenaries from African countries and Asia and all over the place. So um, this is one element of that, and certainly something to remain focused on.
I mean, the China thing made me sort of think again about something else about Zelensky, which is he's a good politician. Like he like any politician, he can spot opportunities to seize to advance sort of his goal. Um,
I don't fully agree. I don't think he's a
okay,
great politician, but I think
okay,
that's what makes him good or has made him good in certain roles or in certain moments. Because, for example, I could not imagine Petro Poroshenko coming out in the early hours and days of the war and delivering a speech like Zelensky did when he said, "I'm here, we're not leaving." I'm paraphrasing. We're going to stand and fight, and motivating an entire country to stand up against a bigger country when they're greatly outnumbered and outarmed and everything, and put up the defense that they did of Kiev and the country more broadly. Poroshenko is a good politician. He's got the history and the skills. He's a savvy operator. He did make a lot of mistakes at the end of um, uh, his term, and his campaign was horrible. And at that point, Ukrainians who love new faces found a new face that they were happy to vote in. But Zelensky has never been a very good politician since taking office. His popularity plummeted and only jumped back up after the full-scale invasion happened, and it's fluctuated some since. It's still well over 50-60%. And he actually just got this Trump bump right after the White House blow up between them, when Ukrainians have said, you know what, he might be an asshole, but he's our asshole, and have shown their support for their president. I think he's a savvy operator who at times is really good at taking advantage of situations uh, for himself and for Ukraine. I think that sometimes there's an overconfidence that gets him in trouble, and the White House visit is one of those situations. And I'm not blaming him for what transpired in the Oval Office, but it was his idea and um, him saying he wanted and had to have an Oval Office meeting that allowed this to happen in the first place. The Americans were happy to sign this U.S. minerals framework deal, not the bigger, broader deal that now they're working on, which is much worse for Ukraine, with the deputy prime minister. Or the first vice prime minister, and a senior Trump administration official. But Zelensky wanted to go there, and his thinking wasn't wrong. That going there would provide him an opportunity to explain to Donald Trump in person in the White House, and a very important visual, message for Putin, and to explain to him what he needed, and to um, go a step beyond that framework deal in saying, look, we want to do this with you, but we do want security guarantees. And this is what we would like. He thought it would be an opportunity to do that. He was not prepared for the whole Trumpian situation, which was the cameras are going to come in and they will stay there and film, and you'll just be stuck as long as Trump wants them there. And
well,
I think he also probably should have relied. I mean, look, in hindsight, I feel like now I'm just there are some things we can criticize in hindsight that in the moment, or before it happened, um, I might not have been critical of. Like, he didn't use his interpreter, and I think he's learned that lesson, and I've noticed that since then he's relied more on an interpreter and spoken in his Ukrainian. While his English has gotten much, much better than it was 3 years ago, it's not fluent. And so he was, not only outmatched in terms of numbers and not even on his home turf, but he was being picked on in his third language, in which he's not fluent, and still did a pretty good job of holding his own. But this was a situation when I think uh, if you talk to diplomats, Western officials who are really pro-Ukrainian, they'll tell they'll tell you, like they've told me, that is as bad as Trump and Vance were that day, and how awful they treated him. Zelensky's a stubborn guy who is a prideful guy and was standing up for himself, but standing up for the country. And um, you know, they understand that. But there's an argument to be made that they could have done what Starmer did just days earlier, and sort of come in and sort of kiss the proverbial ring, right? And bring this invitation to for a second royal visit. And instead,
Well,
Zelensky brought these photographs of Russian or of Ukrainian POWs. That's again hard for Trump to comprehend, and not really the kind of way to win over Trump, right? You don't show him these grim, grisly things that are horrific. You show that to his staff, who can then influence him and inform policy. You present Trump with a gift, you know.
well, it's why the Chinese troops thing really interested me because I saw reports after the Oval Office meeting that Starmer and Macron started to coach Zelensky about how to handle Trump for like a proposed second off Oval Office meeting where they would make up. Um, and I don't think many people catched it, but JD Vance also tried to blow up the Starmer meeting. Uh, at the very end, he brought up some like free speech is being closed down in Britain.
Right.
And Starmer just kind of shut it down while keeping Trump on side. Um, and it didn't get picked up, and sort of it was all nice, and the US UK special relationship continues. And so the China thing made me wonder if there is this effort by Starmer, by Macron, to sort of encourage Zelensky to do go to put things in a way that appeal to Trump, not in a way that you think Trump should be appealed to.
Yes, absolutely. That's true. And they have they have done some tutoring.
Um, but I mean, the point I was going to make about Zelensky is the wider point was the I guess internationally, obviously, the focus is very much on Zelensky as the leader. But as you touched on in some of your reporting recently, there are like simmering domestic politics underneath the surface. Obviously, a lot will depend on how the war ends. But what do you think of the issues or the tensions that will dominate post-war politics in Ukraine?
Uh, well, Zelensky is going to face some really difficult questions about preparedness or lack of preparedness ahead of the full-scale invasion, about many of the decisions that he had to make as a wartime president and supreme commander-in-chief over the course of the war. Depending on how, depending on what the end of this looks like, if it's a hard end, and that means, it's maybe not perfect, but there's an element to it that ensures that, if not just, as he likes to say, a just peace, then a lasting peace, and something that deters Russia from just regrouping and launching a new attack. So if we have something like that, then we'd have something probably resembling a little bit more of a regular campaign, if not a bit rushed, because they do, want to hurry, but hopefully not too hastily, organize a new election. We'll have a campaign that will feature Zelensky, very likely his former top commander Valery Zaluzhny, several other military figures, some old guard politicians like Yulia Tymoshenko and Petro Poroshenko, who will just not go away but stand very little chance of winning. And instead, a lot of new faces, also in the running, and trying to attach themselves to some of the people who are likely to lead those polls. So Zelensky, Zaluzhny, possibly Kirill Budanov from the Military Intelligence Directive. Eh, There, there, there will be some lively debates and discussions for sure. I think one thing that I know senior leadership and people who uh, work in, say, some of the intelligence and security apparatuses in Kiev are worried about is um, no matter if Russia stops its shooting war, it will not stop its hybrid war. And that means that it will still continue to work to destabilize Ukraine from within. And it's had some success at doing that in the past. And it will try to back its own candidates who it thinks can unseat Zelensky and, through politics, bring the country more closely in line with Russia and help it to accomplish the goals that it couldn't accomplish militarily. And in doing that, it will, use disinformation, cyber attacks. It'll play dirty like it has in the past, and that has the potential to cause serious fissures in Ukrainian society and um, widen those cracks that already exist among some who think that these decisions should have been made or these decisions should have been made. That leaves a possibility of the country sort of tearing itself apart. What a good outcome in the war, or why a good outcome in the war is important, is because the unity that we have seen from Ukrainians over the course of this war in the past 3+ years now is important to keep it together afterward. And instead of political infighting and pointing out flaws and going back and rehashing the past and saying, all of these things that went wrong because of you and pointing fingers, there are a lot of people who would like to see a much more united um, country come out of this, and that is possible with by securing a better outcome than one that would mean capitulation. That's when you get a lot of angry people who uh, uh, are going to start pointing fingers, and it won't be Russia's military then that is the biggest threat, but it will be the internal power struggle. Now, I think that's that's also a big concern if, for example, there is a ceasefire in the coming months and they try to rush an election before there's a real end to the war or any real lasting like peace agreement. Then you've got a rushed election. It's really messy. A lot of finger pointing, and that could really destabilize the country. It could be a really bad thing. But I think there are people in Zelensky's office who view a quick, speedy election as their best chance at him winning a second term, and they want him to be in for a second term. But there are, more broadly speaking, reasons and good reasons to um, not hold those and to really play for time. Time is a good thing for Ukraine as well. I know a lot of people think that time is only on the Russian side, that they have endless resources. That isn't necessarily true. And rushing a peace deal in the way that Trump is doing right now is bad for Ukraine. It doesn't give the Europeans time enough to come up with what the security force structure is going to look like, what it's going to be responsible for, how it will respond if attacked, so forth and so on, right? It doesn't give Ukraine enough time to get everything in order that it needs to have in order for it to be on a good foot after a ceasefire. So uh, Ukraine also can benefit from time. Everybody says, "Oh, Russia will regroup, rearm, and reinvade." Well, the Ukrainians can dig in further, better secure their front line. They can also ramp up their own production. They can give some of their seasoned soldiers a break. They can train up new forces. So, time is also good for for Ukraine. If I had to make a prediction, I would say it's going to either happen in a flash, like we're going to be like, well, this is happening. They've called them and they want them done, and now it's become such a thing because Trump's made it this thing that they're just going to have them. Or I don't think we'll see them for a long while. But I don't suspect that they'll happen like on time, or as people are sort of talking about them happening like in October.
Similar to you, I do hope that people realize that they can tell Trump no and nothing happens, like which a lot of people in America seem to be struggling with.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the other thing about elections, and not to dwell on it too much, but it's just the logistics of it. It would be such a nightmare to hold them right now with millions of people living in Russian occupation and millions of Ukrainians displaced from their homes and not living in their home regions, millions more outside of the country, without an embassy or a consulate to vote in, or within a short drive to get to, uh you know to ensure the legitimacy of this thing, um and just to actually ensure that people are able to cast a vote would be a huge task. So none of those things can happen overnight. I know that the Ukrainian government is looking into ways to hold an election, and some people think that a way to test that might be to hold local elections or a smaller election um, first to test the mechanisms that they're working on. That could be something that we see before a big election, or maybe even this year. But I can't even fathom the numerous hurdles that they're going to have to get over to hold what would be deemed by international election observers as a free and fair.
I mean, I also think for Russia, it's also a careful what you wish for kind of thing because, as you kind of detail in the war came to us, when Zelensky came in, they were very optimistic that he would, engage with Russia, come to a deal, and Zelensky tried, and now he fucking hates them. So even if there was a change of leadership, you could see the exact same trajectory of any new president.
Well, the Russians are. We talked about how much Trump doesn't understand Ukraine, but the Russians don't understand it either. I mean that's evident in how badly their military operation has gone. They were using, 30, 40-year-old Soviet era maps of Kyiv during their invasion. They thought that the Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms as liberators, that they still viewed Moscow as, a big brother, and uh, didn't come to despise Russia even after its annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass. And, they have a deep, certainly Putin has a deep misunderstanding of Ukraine. Um, and I think that's a big element of it.
Can you see any silver linings?
Well, I've given you several.
Big picture one.
hmm. Well, um, I mean, I think, the track that Europe has put itself on is a silver lining of this, and I see that as a positive. If Americans get their act together and reject Trump and MAGA, we'll be able to say it was probably this period and that did it, and not just his trade war, but his handling of foreign policy and his alienation of close allies, and being in many ways on the wrong side of the biggest war in 80 years. Um, I think in and this might be dependent on how the war comes to an end. I think we have seen the strengthening of a nation in Ukraine, even if, and I know that sounds uh, incongruous, when you think of how much of it is occupied. 20% of the country, I guess, is under Russian occupation, right? But still, I think as a nation, it could come away from this um, more European, more respected, with a seat at the big kids table from here on out, rather than being, um, sort of thought of as still this kind of backwater, second world country that isn't quite ready or deserving of being a part of the EU, right? Um,
I mean,
and
I
then the
interviewed. So I interviewed a few days into the start of the full-scale invasion, Tuma Silvas, the former Estonian president, and he was saying how in the 90s, when Estonia was trying to join NATO, an American official said to him that we'd take Croatia because like they fought a war recently, but we're not too sure about Estonia because you guys have never fought. And he sort of made the point how Ukraine will have the most experienced, advanced army that's had recent combat experience in the biggest conflict since the Second World War, and sort of the benefit and the seat at the table that will buy them in
That's
sort of
absolutely
future
right.
European.
I mean, something that's not talked about enough certainly is how big of an asset Ukraine is going to be. Uh, and I was just having this conversation last week with an FT colleague of mine who is producing the Tectonic podcast. He was in town to interview people about drone warfare and military technology and how quickly it's developing. And we were talking with some of these drone unit commanders about how the Europeans and the Americans should really, be doing a lot more to learn from the Ukrainians. It's not just about the Ukrainians, begging and pleading for help. Actually, uh, those, begging and pleading to learn new techniques and technologies and how they can be deployed and utilized should be coming from the other direction too. And then uh, these Western armies that have never fought a battle or a war like the Ukrainians are fighting right now will have relevant training and in case that does happen and Russia wins this thing or something, or there's um, a, a, a bad end to it that emboldens Putin and he tries to attack, God forbid, the Baltics, and Estonia being, one of those that's certainly in the crosshairs, right? Then these countries will have that experience. They'll have a strong relationship with the Ukrainians who will want to help them. So that could be a silver lining.
And finally, who's more manly, Zelensky or Putin?
Zelensky, hands down. Just because you take your shirt off and ride atop a horse through the mountains or something, doesn't make you a man. Putin has hardly ever visited a frontline position. Zelensky goes on a weekly basis, but not only that. I mean, the guy is actually, you know, commanding commanding an underdog country and holding his own in the largest war on European soil in 80 years. No, he walks the walk, while Putin sits in his isolated Kremlin office and just runs his mouth.
I mean, he looked a bit try hard and then fatigues the other week.
Yeah, he
Putin.
does try, but they don't fit him well, like he looks very out of place in his fatigues. I think it's hard for me to even think about Zelensky in a suit anymore. A friend of mine sent me a video of one of the first meetings that I had with Zelensky as president. It was during this marathon press conference that lasted like 13 or 14 hours in Kiev, and it was at this Kiev food hall, and we were sitting around like neon signs that said like champagne or prosecco and beef, and Zelensky's in a suit and he's clean shaven. And he doesn't have the buzz cut, the military type buzz cut. It's not as tight. It's a little bit, kind of scruffy. Um, and I'm asking him a question about Igor Kolomoisky because we didn't even talk about oligarchs here, but that's another issue. And he's answering my question, and He looks much smaller. His stature is smaller. It's definitely before he started hitting the weights, in his presidential compound. And now I look at those old photos of him, and he looks like a completely different person. He's got his war beard, he's got his military fatigues, and I think he wears them well. Certainly more manly than the very soft, puffy-faced Putin in his Kremlin office, sitting behind his long table.
I mean, it's what filler will do to you.
True.
Chris Miller, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me on.